Hello everyone, welcome to AnyDB. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use an AnyDB's pre-built database template to manage vendors, suppliers, and partners. And remember also that you can adapt it and change it at any time, depending on your needs. Now, vendor management is all about managing a relationship with these third parties and service providers in order to maximize the value that they bring to you, to your company, and at the same time reduce costs along the workflow. So in order to make these in a proper manner, the workflow that as a company you can use is this. First, you need to select the vendor, and then through that, you generate the contracts, and then you onboard the vendor. And next, you evaluate performance. And then, if that makes sense, you can also offboard the vendor that terminates that relationship. And then we start everything again. So it's a smooth process. It should be very clear. Select the vendor, generate contracts, onboard the vendor, evaluate performance a long time, and then terminate if that's the case. Now, in our database, here is a conceptual model where you can understand how the records are connected. So, for example, in the first place, we've got the vendor dashboard. The vendor dashboard tracks the other records. So you've got the contact lists records, you've got the onboarding checklist records, offboarding checklist, contracts, compliance and performance, audit checklist, and requests for proposals. And as you can see, this particular record, as a contact list name says, is also connected to another record, which is a contact individually. So here is a minor dashboard for contacts. And here you also can see a request for proposals records that also tracks a request for proposal response, which means that the vendor will submit their response to your RFPs. Now, as you can see, all of these records are centralized to the vendor dashboards, to the master records. Now, let's see how it works. So here you've got a conceptual modeling of the vendor dashboards, as you can see here. So this is how all of these records are displayed into these records. So you've got the vendor information, here you've got the context list, and then onboarding checklist, offboarding checklist. You've got a contract summary, which means that here is the dashboards that you can follow up the data in real time. You've got also the performance review, which is another dashboard. And then you've got the list of contracts, the monitoring performance records, and then the need assessment. Now, this is the starting point of all of the data that are interconnected to each other. And as an example, now let's jump into the database inside AnyDB so you can see how that works in practice. Now, let's take a look at a quick overview of this template. So here, what you're seeing is actually the master template, which means that all the other items or all the other templates will be connected to this one. So this is a centralized template that is catching all of the others' informations and data. So for example, in this first section, we've got the vendor information, and then we've got the onboarding checklist, offboarding checklist, a small dashboard showing the contract summary, performance review, and you've got the section of contracts, which means that all of the contracts will be here. And you can see also monitoring performance templates, which means that all of the items related to performance, such as logistics KPIs, such as auditing items, will be here. And then you've got the need assessments, which means that requests for proposals will be here. Now, let's see the first section at first place. So vendor information, as you can see, is about adding all of the vendor's details, such as company name, an address, an email, contact number, and so on. On the right side, you can see also a contact section and a contact list. As you can see here, by clicking on here, you can be redirected to the contact list management, which means that this company has all of the necessarily contacts attached to it. So if you need to contact someone, let's say an example, a marketing analyst, you can actually add this contact here and then set up the status, such as contacted, not contacted. As you can see, it's automatically changed here, and then you can easily see and locate yourself. So once the vendor is selected and the vendor information is added, we're going to look at the next step. Now, the next step is about creating a need assessment, which means that we are going to create a RFP for vendor, a request for proposal. In order to do that, we're going to click on this plus sign and RFP for vendor. And then this is the request for proposal details. So as you can see, here is a RFP title, which means that this is a service or the product that we're trying to get. As Nee's example, it's about CRM system. Now you can also add some relevant information such as submission deadline, data, contact person, contact phone, and so on. You can also set up status that will be displayed here on badge sections. And you can also add level of priority. And then in the next section of RFP description, you're going to add the summary and the scope of the work. So basically, this is about specifying all the details that you're trying to get from this service. And then you can add the requirements and criteria, which means all these specifications of this service or product should be here. And the next step is about just sharing this with your vendor. So the vendor will submit a response to this RFP by actually clicking on here. And here again, the RFP informations are repeated, and then the vendor will submit an answer on this section, attachment of vendor response. So here is all the items that your RFP is specifying. So for example, on this process, on this service, it should be contained a sales management. So your vendor can actually add a file, a document, or any other documents that specifies the vendor's service related to sales management in order to be analyzed by your company. And as you can see, the vendor can add multiple files and multiple items related to it. And we can also add some notes. And then you as a company can also add and set up priorities. For example, if sales management is the top one point of this service, of this RFP, so it would be high. If marketing automation is not that a priority, so you can add it as low priority. And here you can also set up an importance data, which means that if the item is accepted, and then you can set up here. If it's denied, then you can set up here as well, or pending. Pending is about needs to be analyzed. Now, this is a very important section because at the same time, you can actually customize this area according to your needs. You have a clear vision about what's going on. And then here you have a summary. So for this RFP, the estimated total cost will be 5,000. So you can actually add any number here, and it's automatically will be captured by the badge, which means a summary of this RFP. So the vendor company is here, the RFP title is here again, the status and the total cost. Now, once the request for proposal of a company, of a vendor is accepted and awarded, the next step is to create a contract. Now, here in the contract section, you can add a contract by clicking on this button. So let's take a look at this example of a vendor contract. So as you can see, here on the title, you can see that the contract is related to the CRM system. And then you've got, again, the vendor information. Here, you also got the context section. And then you've got a contracts information, which is a summary of a contract, which is basically, it's composed by the description of the RFP. So here is about CRM system. And then you can set up status such as approved, rejected, active, or inactive for these particular contracts. And then you can add the total cost. Then on the agreement section, you can actually add and attach to it the contract itself, which might be an article, PDF file, or any other document format. You can attach it. You can attach it to here. here you can add other files such as transport contracts or any other supportive documents for this contract, such as intellectual property contracts or any other things like payment terms or even term and termination. You can add here, and then you can add also some notes by explaining what's going on. And then you've got finally an approval section, which means that you can assign people, particular people that need to consult, need to review these agreements in order to be approved. So for example, one person can actually approve it by setting up a status here. And additionally, you can also add the commands, dates approved, and so on. Now, here is a summary of the contract, which you can also share with any other person outside or inside the company. So now we've got our vendor contract active, and then the next step is about onboarding this vendor. So clicking on this row, you go to the onboarding checklist, and this list is about all of the things that the vendor needs to provide or needs to engage in order to make sure that the vendor will be properly set up in the new company's process. So for example, this section is about vendor screening and qualification. So the checklist is about providing an overview of the steps needed to make the vendor ready to initiate the work. So for example, if agreement is signed, is there any certification that needs to be signed, that needs to be checked up and checked out? So this list will show all of these things. So for example, in the documentation and information collection, this is about to make sure if the vendor has a legal business name, if the legal entity information is properly set up. Insurance certificates, is there anything that must be checked before the vendor start the work? And then the next section is about communication integration. So establish your communication channels, systems, accessibility, such as mails accessibility, portals, software's accessibility, in order to make sure that the vendor is ready to initiate the work. So let's come back. And then the next step is about monitoring performance. So there are two items that needs to be checked in order to make sure the process is correct. So the first item is vendor compliance and performance. So by clicking here, you can see there is another list, but it's different from the onboarding checklist. This list is where the vendor will attach all of the documents and the legal documents, certifications, in order to make sure that these vendor meets all the requirements in order to operate. So for example, let's say that the vendor has a profile information, such as address, contact, legal name, in a proper document. So the document will be here. And then once the document's attached here, the company can see exactly all the details about this vendor. So if the vendor needs to operate with a business license specifically, so the license needs to be added here. And then ISO certification, financial statement, or government permission, insurances, commercial property insurances, all of these things can be attached to it. Now, the next section is about quality and performance, which means that here is a place where you can add the relevant KPIs and monitor it and update them regularly. So, for example, from period, and then you can actually add a rate here, such as the factor rate in percentages, and this will be daily updated in order to make sure that your final dashboard will show the real-time data. So for example, besides the defect rate section here, you can actually add a report such as, let's say, PPT presentation or any other documents about this defect rate, you can actually add here as well. So by following up the others, you can also add the rework rate, on-time delivery. So this is a place to add the KPIs. And there are many ways that you can do it. You can do it by typing it directly, or you can do it by connecting to another document. So everything's connected at one place. And then you've got the audit findings. Now, the audit findings is about where you can actually recommend an action plan and describe any other things that are important for the vendor to be aware of. Now here there are some status as well, such as approved or not approved or approved with conditions in the compliance and performance. And as you can see, the badges are automatically updated, so you have a quick review of what's going on with this vendor. Now the other item is the vendor audit checklist, which means that here is an auditing action by itself. So for example, if you need to know if the vendor profile information are accurate, then this is the list that will guide you in order to make sure that all these things are correct set. So quality and performance, are there documented quality control procedures in place? So there are standard operation procedures and so on. Security and compliance, financial business continuity. And here you can also evaluate the risk of dealing with this vendor. And additionally, there are also the status that you can, change if needed. And then once you click yes for all of these things, you can see that the progression is also updated. So you have an overview of the auditing process. And finally, once the monitoring performance is conducted, and then you decide that this relationship needs to be finished or completed or inactivated, then the next step is about going to the contract and turn it inactive. And then the next step is about going to the offboarding checklist by clicking on this arrow. And then here you've got all the lists that the important points the vendor needs to take in order to make sure that this termination is properly set up and secured and with safety and security for both parties. So for example, all the documentation about terminating the contract needs to be followed up by this checklist. So for example, operational termination, is there any physical materials or anything that the vendor must give back to the company, such as software accessibility or physical accessibility, such as ID, professional cards, or any additional requirements about this termination process should be listed here. And then you can make sure that this termination is completed with safety for both parties. As you can see, you can change the status and to make sure that you don't miss anything.